Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
In fact, in the distant, distant past, when the earth was still completely deserted, God came down from heaven to save all living things that remained on that earth. And when the world began to flourish and prosper peacefully, God ascended again to heaven, leaving people to live on their own. Before his departure, he made his last and sincere gift to humanity. He gave his mind to the most valuable person. He gave a part of his body to the second most valuable man so that he would be strong and able to protect his people. And the two who received God's gifts grew up and became the first magician and knight on that land. This story, which has remained only a legend, which has long been forgotten by humanity over the years, tells the story of one girl. An ordinary woman of humble origin and the head of the great family of magicians gave birth to one girl. This girl's name was Jade Browen, and this poor thing had a great tragedy. She had to attend funerals since she was a child. After her parents died of fever, she was left as the only child of the head of the family. However, people, of course, did not like poor Jade because she was a mudblood to them, since two bloods were mixed. But despite all this, she became the heiress of the respected house of Browen, between her grandmother, the matriarch of the family, who refused to acknowledge her, and her relatives, who unashamedly coveted power and were waiting for the moment to take her place as heir. Jade understood her situation better than anyone else. She knew that she would have a very hard time in this world. However, as soon as she remembered her wonderful parents, whom she loved with all her heart, she felt a little better. They always talked about how proud she was of them and how much they loved and appreciated her. But the terrible fever did not spare even such wonderful people, and poor Jade was left completely alone in a terrible, envious world. But even though everyone treated her terribly, Jade knew she was definitely not going to be broken. She was ready to take revenge on anyone who stood in her way. The girl was ready to burn down even all the forests if necessary, because she was a proud daughter of her parents. But Jade was also a mage who had the greatest potential in the entire world. People just didn't know what she was capable of yet. Jade believed that her flame would definitely not be extinguished, no matter what happened on her way, because she had to defend her name and honor. But one day, when she grew up and went to the army, something bad happened to her. Jade began to wake up from a deep sleep and suddenly felt her head hurt very badly. After the girl opened her eyes with difficulty, she noticed that she was completely tied up, and this surprised her very much. Jade was absolutely sure that she was hunting monsters, but now she didn't understand where she was at all, or why she felt so bad. She decided that she would deal with all this a little later, namely her headache and so on. The first thing she needed to do was get out of this terrible and unfamiliar place. Jade managed to sit up with difficulty, and she, of course, did not know what kind of sick idiot tied her up. However, she is a famous fire mage, and this rope certainly will not be able to stop her. The girl sat down and tried to activate her abilities, and also cast a spell out loud. However, after several attempts, nothing happened, although this rope should have burned to the ground in a second. Jade continued to try, but then she suddenly realized that her magic was not working for some reason. At that moment, she panicked, because she assumed that she had used up all her mana while hunting. She didn't understand why all this happened to her at that very moment, but then suddenly someone started coming up to her room. She heard footsteps behind her. As these steps began to approach, the girl could also hear someone's voices discussing someone. Jade immediately panicked, because she knew that these people were heading straight for her. Then a man said that he was very busy, so he asked his assistants to deal with this as soon as possible. His assistant asked in surprise if he had really shown up so early just for this. But the man replied that all his plans had already been ruined because of this, so he couldn't wait any longer. Jade could tell from their voices and manner of speech that they were a young man and a middle-aged woman. She had absolutely no time to untie the ropes, so she decided that the best way would be to come up with another plan. The girl, because her legs were not tied, was able to approach the door, and as soon as the door opened and a woman entered, she immediately began to run out. Because the surprise effect worked, the woman got scared, and Jade was very happy that she still managed to escape, so she began to run even faster. She had no intention of stopping and continued running as fast as she could. But then she suddenly remembered that there were two people, judging by the voices. This made her very wary, and then, suddenly running past, she saw out of the corner of her eye a young guy next to her. At that moment, his hand reached out to her, and he immediately grabbed her in his arms so that she would not run away again. Jade immediately started screaming loudly. She asked him to leave her alone and let her go, also calling him an idiot, a kidnapper, and kicking her legs all the time. But at that moment, the stranger reached for her head wound, from which blood was already flowing. She asked him to remove his hands right now, otherwise he would definitely be in trouble. But the man did not listen. In a quiet voice, he told her to freeze, because her wound was bleeding again, and she needed to be more careful. Jade was incredibly surprised at that moment. She looked at this beautiful guy and didn't answer. The stranger, continuing to hold her wound with his finger to stop the bleeding, said that he would not forgive her if she bled all over the floors. Jade was horrified. She didn't understand what he was even saying. And what normal person would behave like that? So she came back to normal and started screaming loudly. Jade asked why the hell she should care if her captor had mesophobia. She also asked who hired him and asked him to answer immediately. Jade wondered if it was Felix. She started to name a few names, but at that moment, an old woman standing behind him started laughing loudly. The girl and this unfamiliar guy immediately looked at the old woman in surprise and did not understand why she suddenly started laughing at such an important and dramatic moment. But the woman smiled and told Jade that, judging by how lively she was, the girl was already completely fine, so they didn't have to worry. The elderly woman also responded in a calm voice that the girl must have misunderstood something, since they had not kidnapped her, so she could calm down and not rage so much anymore. Jade, hearing this, was very surprised and asked if they really hadn't kidnapped her, and also asked who they were in that case. At that moment, the guy sighed heavily and asked if she really didn't remember this. Seeing her surprised look, he said that he was the one who saved her. Jade was shocked and asked what he even meant. She didn't understand when he could have saved her at all. But then suddenly one memory came to her mind. How she, having found herself in the water, was almost suffocating. But then she felt strong hands that began to lift her up. Remembering all this, Jade felt very uneasy. She didn't know all the details, because she hit her head a little and lost her memory. But she understood that this certainly wouldn't lead to anything good. She didn't understand what kind of feeling suddenly arose in her at that moment. She somehow restored a very important memory in her mind. Jade was silent for a moment, then she screamed loudly, asking how this was even possible. The man and the woman looked at her in surprise, not understanding what was going on or why she had such a violent reaction, since nothing like that had happened. But at that moment, Jade suddenly felt a severe headache. She felt dizzy, and her face turned white as a sheet. The woman, when she saw her in such a state, immediately came closer and asked if everything was okay with her, because she was really scared. However, Jade, of course, was scared by such a gesture. She jumped back and told her not to even think about touching her. After that, she started shouting loudly at them and asked why they were holding her like that if they were trying to save her. The man, hearing this, was very surprised, and the woman at that moment could not contain her emotions and began to laugh very loudly, even to tears. Jade looked at them in surprise and did not understand what was happening at all. Then the man answered in a calm voice that he tied her with a blanket so that her wound would not open, and also apologized if she suddenly thought that they were forcibly holding her. The girl was very surprised when she heard this. She immediately looked down at herself and noticed that her hands were indeed tied. Of course, when she was in the dark, she thought it was a rope, but in fact it turned out to be a simple blanket so that she would not open her wound even more. The man also said that since the misunderstanding had been cleared up, it was now her turn to answer a few of his questions. He looked Jade straight in the eyes and asked who she was and why she was in the forest at such a time, all alone. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised, and asked what he was talking about, and also what forest he was talking about. At this point, the old woman finally calmed down a little and asked if she even knew how many people went to Atnas Forest. She also told the man that he was asking completely stupid questions. However, he turned to her and replied that he had already told her. This was something completely different. Jade immediately interrupted their conversation and asked what forest they had just talked about. She was horrified when she heard its name again. The girl could not believe that she was actually in the Atnas Forest. In fact, every mage born in a certain era eventually learns about 3 locations. The first was the Florensky Forest, which contains many rare herbs and mystical animals that can be both very dangerous and incredibly beautiful. The second location was the Dausch Forest. It is known as a historical place where the king magician left strong traces of magic. And the very last location was a place that was completely different from the previous 2. This is the only forbidden place among all the magicians. It was also a place where no spell offered to God could be activated. In other words, it is a place that turns every magician into an ordinary, helpless person. And this place was precisely that same Atnas Forest in which the girl now found herself. Jade said in a trembling voice that it was probably just a dream. She was so stunned that she even lost her balance and fell to the ground. In fact, there was one day when her grandmother invited Jade to her place, despite the fact that she disliked her very much. She brought her to her estate, and passing by the portrait, the woman said that she loved Yannick, her eldest son, very much. However, he simply went and betrayed her. And once the king appointed the woman a knight, the price Yannick paid for joining him did not go unpunished. Her grandmother said that she could not allow such a base love with common blood to pollute their lineage, which was respected in the Brown family. Of course, Jade found all this completely unpleasant to listen to because she was saying the same thing as always. And because of this, the girl even became a little bored. But then suddenly, her grandmother turned to her and said that even though it was only half of her constitution, she still had Yannick's blood in her. So, anyway, she said that Jade would live as the heir to the Brown house and asked the girl to promise her one very important thing. Her grandmother said that the person she keeps next to her must be the most ideal and from a respected family. Only then, everything will be fine. She also added that his blood should not be stained with anything. This person should be a purebred aristocrat in order to at least slightly correct the situation that happened to her parents. In fact, Jade was very surprised when she heard this from her grandmother. However, the woman said that if she did not do this, she would never have any authority in the family, even if she became the head of the house. It was then that her grandmother explained to her that she had only 2 choices. The first was to live as her grandmother's puppet, and the other way is to build your own path with your own hands, no matter what. However, Jade had to find her own way in life, to choose her own path and not follow the dictates of her grandmother. So she soon appeared before the king and, bowing, said that she was very pleased to finally meet him. She also gave him her name so that he would know with whom he was communicating. The man then smiled playfully and asked if she really was that famous fire mage. As soon as he saw the girl in person, he said that she was quite young, and he imagined her a little differently. Jade, of course, didn't like the way he said it, because she knew perfectly well that because of her age, few would take her seriously. However, she was ready to go to great lengths. After the king emerged victorious in the Battle of the Bloody Crown, he wiped absolutely all traces of his brothers from the face of this world. The man did a lot just to become king, and that is why the people called him the ruthless young king. When Jade came to him, he smiled and said that they were both very busy, so he asked her to get straight to the point and skip all these unnecessary formalities. The man also said that he heard that she needed someone to support her in her own home, but Jade replied that she had absolutely no idea what he meant. But he said that it just happened that he needed her, and now he would support her at any cost in the political struggle. He then extended his hand forward and asked her if she could be on his side and become his person. Of course, Jade was a little surprised, but after bowing, she said that she was already his person, and also asked how she could become his again. The king smiled smugly and said that all she had to do was name her price, and then they would work together. He also said that he was ordering her to join the monster hunt. Jade, of course, did not object and said that she would do everything as he ordered her. And so, when she went hunting for monsters, some kind of disaster happened there, which the girl unfortunately could not remember. The last thing she saw before she finally woke up was water. Waking up in horror on her bed, she immediately sat up and breathed heavily. The wound on her head was still bleeding slightly. The girl was breathing very heavily because of everything she saw in front of her. Little by little, she finally began to remember everything, and it was very good. Jade remembered joining a monster hunt, and that day was like any other, but soon something terrible happened. Her teleportation magic then went out of control and malfunctioned, so she ended up in a completely different place. Thus, Jade found herself in the Atnas Forest. She was glad that she finally remembered what had happened. But now she had another problem. She knew she had to hurry to get out of this place as quickly as possible. So without thinking twice, she jumped to her feet and started running. For a mage of her level, this place was too deadly, so she needed to escape as soon as possible. But as soon as Jade opened the door, she was so caught up in her thoughts that she didn't even notice the man standing there and bumped head-on into him. Because she ran too fast, she couldn't stay on her feet and immediately began to fall backwards. She was lucky that there was a man standing nearby who managed to catch her in time and immediately asked, did she really have a habit of constantly bumping into someone? Jade felt very awkward about all this. She looked him straight in the eyes but couldn't answer. As soon as she saw him, she immediately realized that this was the man who saved her. She did not notice how handsome he was and fainted quite quickly. But now, when she was very close to him, she could not help but notice it. Especially his beautiful gray eyes were very mysterious, but it seemed to her that she could look into them forever. But at that moment he turned to her and said that if she had nothing to say, then it would be better to get up and go away. The girl immediately stood up and asked him for forgiveness, and she thought that, unlike his face, his conversation was the most terrible. But at that moment he went inside and started looking at something. Then Jade, who stayed behind, watched him closely. In fact, his physique impressed her very much, but she had to not think about it, because she had to find cooperation with him in order to have a chance to escape. She didn't understand how he wasn't cold in just a shirt, because she was cold even in her military uniform. But then the man suddenly turned to her and asked if her pain had gotten better. The girl, lost in her thoughts, immediately asked what he meant. Then the man asked if the pain in her wound had become a little less. Jade immediately remembered that she had been shot in the head and said that she was actually feeling much better. She had been having an incredibly severe headache before, but now she was feeling better. True, upon hearing this, he immediately said that in that case it was very good. But in fact, Jade was surprised that he was worried about her well-being. Even though he spoke rather rudely, she suggested that perhaps he was not such a bad person. Then suddenly, she saw him approach the table and start putting something on the board. Jade immediately beamed with joy and asked, was he really getting ready to cook food? She also asked if there was anything she could help him with. At that moment, the man turned around and looked at her very sternly for a while. After that, he said that if she went outside and turned right, she could find a place where she could take a bath. Jade was a little indignant when she heard this. She couldn't believe that he was implying that she smelled and needed to wash herself urgently. She immediately asked him what he was trying to tell her. The man replied that she smelled like rotten leaves, so she should go and wash her body thoroughly. Jade, when she heard this, was very surprised and could not believe that he actually said that she smelled like rotten leaves, because this was the smell she hated the most. But immediately after that, she went to take a shower, and when she had finished her bath, she returned to the man and said that she was sure that she no longer smelled the way he said. So Jade, beaming with joy, also said that she could help him with anything. He also gave her his clothes, so the girl changed. However, these clothes were many times bigger than hers, so they looked pretty funny. But the man didn't pay any attention to all this. He said that if she really wanted to help, she could cut the bread into pieces that would be convenient to eat. Jade immediately went to the loaf of bread that was lying on the board, and when she saw that the bread was black, she was a little upset, because she always eats only white. She actually saw something like this for the first time and wasn't sure if it was safe to eat. However, some time had passed since then, and Jade finally gathered her strength and cut the bread, while the man had already prepared food for them. As soon as he approached her, he saw how carelessly the bread was cut. It was as if it was broken into different pieces, and at some moments it even seemed to him that someone had already chewed it. Then, looking at her, he said that she probably grew up in a rich family. When Jade heard this, she was very surprised and did not understand why he came to such a conclusion. Laughing tenderly, she asked, did she really look quite noble since he made such an assumption? But without waiting for an answer, the girl said that in fact, she grew up in a rather difficult situation, so it was impossible to say that she was really rich. The man placed the plates on the table and said that even though she had grown up in a difficult situation, he thought she still never had to slice her own bread. Jade suddenly became very uncomfortable with this, as she said in a trembling voice that she didn't actually cut the bread. She preferred to eat it whole and with her own hands. The man sighed heavily and said that she looked like she did it all the time. Because the girl didn't like it, she didn't answer and just started eating her food. But at that moment, she wondered if it would be safe for her to eat this food from a stranger. Then she looked at the man, who had just taken a second spoonful of his soup and eaten it. Jade guessed that it might be safe, so she plucked up her courage and took a spoonful of the soup and tasted it. But as soon as the soup hit her mouth, she was incredibly surprised. In fact, she had already forgotten that it could be poisoned because this dish was simply delicious. The man, as soon as he saw the strange expression on her face, began to watch closely as Jade, incredibly hungry, began to bite off her bread like a beast and very quickly take spoon after spoon of soup. After some time, the girl realized that she was behaving in a completely uncultured manner. So, blushing a little, she asked him for forgiveness and said that she was simply really hungry. After that, after chewing the rest of her food in her mouth, she said her name with a smile on her face and thought that it would be better to hide her real last name, so she came up with another one. The man, continuing to carefully eat his food, said that his name was Axel. However, Jade wasn't sure if that was true, but she didn't dwell on it too much. She said that it was probably a little late, but she still wanted to thank him for saving her, as well as for healing her wounds. But then her voice suddenly became a little quieter, and she asked if they were really in the Atnas Forest. Axel didn't answer. Then he looked out the window, from which he could see many trees, and there was an awkward silence between them. But then he said that she was definitely a mage. Jade became very serious and said that she really was a mage. As soon as she said that, she immediately began to observe the expression on his face and thought that he was more straightforward than she thought, and also assumed that he knew quite a lot about magicians. Jade knew he was definitely not an ordinary citizen. The man was silent again for a while, then said that she must have noticed one very important thing right away. And slowly drawing out each word, he said that in this place she could not use magic at all. Jade didn't respond to this. She turned to Axel and asked if he knew how to get out of this Atnas Forest. The man closed his eyes, sighed heavily, and said that he really didn't know. Then the girl continued to insist on her own, asking if there was anyone who had such information. Axel was silent for a while and then asked her if she knew why this place was called the Hermit's Forest. The girl didn't answer. Then he explained that this forest was actually alive, and it wasn't a metaphor at all. It was reality. The forest boundaries are constantly changing, and roads that once existed immediately disappear. And if you walk completely boundlessly and without knowing where you are going, you can get completely lost and even die in the end. If someone enters this forest, he will not be able to escape or find a way out. And that is why it is an ideal place for all hermits. Jade, when she heard all this, was incredibly surprised. She said that this simply could not be true. She was overcome with panic because she understood that if this was really true, then she had no way out. But Axel said in a calm voice that there were people in this place who knew how to enter and exit this forest. The girl couldn't hold back. She immediately stood up and screamed loudly, asking who they were. The man sighed heavily and said that these were traders who traded with the rest of the people in the forest. They had been trading for many generations, and they knew absolutely everything about the forest that they had built over a very long period of time. It is assumed that there is a so-called marker that never changes. Jade, upon hearing all this, immediately beamed with joy and said that this was simply wonderful news. She also added with a smile on her face that in that case, she could ask the merchant about how to get out of this place, and then that would be the end of it. She also added that she would simply be under his care until that time came, and everything would end well. But Axel, getting up from the table, said that the reason why traders come to the forest is because rare animals or herbs that cannot be found anywhere else are found right there. And he wondered if she thought there was always a surplus of these things. Of course not. That's why the merchants come once every season. And it just happened recently. Axel said that they left exactly 5 days ago, which means that they won't be back soon. It will only happen in a few months, and that's the fastest time. Jade was incredibly surprised. She had already hoped that she would be able to get out very soon, but this was not the case. And then she wondered if she really was going to remain locked in this place until the traders returned. Axel, suddenly smiling, said that if she didn't want to stay, she could wait anywhere else. After all, he had a lot to do before the next season. She couldn't believe that he was actually smiling when she was in such grief. Holding back her anger, she asked if he knew that she planned to stay in this place with him until she could leave. As soon as the guy heard this, he was immediately very surprised. His smile quickly disappeared from his face, and he could not believe that she was actually saying such a thing. Then it was time for Jade to smile, and she said that she also hoped that he would take good care of her during this time. Of course, Axel was not at all happy about this, and his face immediately changed its expression. He did not answer the girl, but only sat and watched. When the next morning came, the man woke up quite early and immediately went into the forest to do some chores. When he was already returning to his hut, he was not very happy, because he heard some noise nearby and became very wary. But at that moment, Jade appeared right in front of Axel. She was hanging from the tree upside down, and when she saw the man, she immediately greeted him with a smile on her face. As she continued to stretch, she said she was curious if the spells would work at a certain height, so she decided to experiment. Axel didn't react to this in any way, because he didn't really like his roommate now, so he tried to avoid her as much as he could. The next day, the girl did even worse. She found some rope somewhere, and said that she thought that if she went further, then maybe everything would work. Jade explained that she didn't want to get lost, so she decided to use the rope to track her way back. Axel didn't react to this at all. He started to go back home and said that her rope was all tangled up, so it would take her a long time to finally untangle it. The next day, Jade was traveling again and came back absolutely dirty, so naturally she splashed the man's floor all over. Then he couldn't contain his anger. However, on the 4th day, he couldn't stand it anymore and started shouting at her loudly, saying that he had had enough. Jade was very surprised and asked what he was talking about. She also said that she decided to find a way out of this forest because she needs to get out as soon as possible, so she is trying to do everything in her power. Axel, continuing to yell at her, asked how many more times he had to tell her that even he couldn't move around this place alone without a map. Of course, after he yelled at the girl, she was very down and upset. That's why she didn't even go outside that day, but sat in the hut and was sad all the time. Suddenly, Axel was going somewhere. When Jade saw this, she immediately paid attention and asked where he was going. The man replied that it was none of her business, so he wasn't going to tell her. Jade immediately rose from her chair and said that she would go with him. She did not want to sit in the hut all day while he was gone. So now she added that she also needed to get used to the paths that were nearby. Axel, of course, was not very happy with this idea and asked if he really wanted him to take her with him. The girl immediately smiled and said that she wanted it, but he sharply replied that it would not happen. Then she began to scream loudly and asked why he did not want to take her with him. Axel asked her if she really wanted to know why he wouldn't take her. He also warned her that it would hurt her feelings. Jade confidently replied that she might want to be hurt, so she was ready for anything. The man was silent for a while, and then said that he would chop wood and hunt along the way, but she obviously looked like she had a very poor understanding of all these things. And that's why he thinks that if he takes her with him, she will only get in his way. So his answer is no. Jade immediately ran closer. She grabbed his arm and said that in that case she would only go with him until he got to the place where he chopped wood. She also explained that she would not disturb him, but would just sit silently and watch everything he did. Then the girl made a very pitiful look so that he agreed. Axel looked at her, sighed heavily, and then said that she really had better behave quietly and not disturb him, otherwise everything would end badly. Then the two of them went into the forest anyway. The man took an axe with him to chop wood. When they entered the thicket, Jade looked around and was very surprised. She kept looking in different directions and admiring. The girl said that she knew the names of those trees and also saw dried fruits. She could not keep silent for a minute, because when she saw them, she said that they were very useful for colds, and also asked if she should take a few, because perhaps one of them would soon get sick. Jade was incredibly happy about this walk, because she also saw very rare grass and said that she had only seen something like this in textbooks. She said that she couldn't stand it all. She needed to collect these specimens urgently. So she asked Axel to wait for her a little, because it wouldn't take much time. Soon, she had already collected several sprouts, and asking for forgiveness, said that this would indeed be the last one. But of course, she would see something else further on, and would want to collect it. Then Axel turned to her and said that it had actually been a long time since he had last seen a mage who was truly interested in herbology. The girl was a little surprised by this question, so she remained silent for a while. After that, she said that she didn't really have a talent for the earth element, so she couldn't use healing magic. So she studied herbology instead. Although she thinks that it is still pointless, since wherever you go, there is at least one earth mage, so there is absolutely no point in this knowledge. However, at that moment, Axel came closer to her and said that he thought differently. Jade smiled happily and said that he seemed to know a lot about different mages, and asked if she could ask what he did for the job that was outside. Of course, the man didn't answer this, considering the question stupid, and simply went about his business. The girl looked at him in surprise for a while, and then said that in the end, she had talked a lot about herself, but had not found out anything about this man. Jade didn't understand what he was doing that was so secretive about his past. In fact, the forest they were in also had another name, God-abandoned land. And that is why people never go to this forest. And those who have abandoned their duties and rights in the outside world naturally came here to simply hide forever in this forest and not contact people. However, Axel didn't look like a fugitive at all, so Jade didn't know what he was doing in such a closed place. In fact, when she first woke up, she saw that there was a sword attached to the wall next to the fireplace. She supposed that this sword always stood in exactly this place. In form, it was quite simple, but this extreme simplicity made it look even more extravagant at first glance. Jade thought that he probably had the rank of knight, and he was also a very strong man. After that, they went to another part of the forest, where the man began to chop down a tree. He had the simplest and most uncomplicated axe, but with its help he was able to cut down an entire thick tree in just a few blows. When Jade saw this, she was amazed. Immediately after this, the man began to chop the huge log into several small pieces for convenience. After a while, she came closer to him and asked him to let her try it too. She was sure that she would succeed. Axel, hearing about this, was very surprised, and then asked if she was even sure that she could cope with even one small log. The girl was not at all offended by this question. She immediately went to the axe and said that, of course, she could do all this, and also added that he should take a break, because he was probably a little tired. But at that moment, as soon as she approached the stump and was about to get the axe, she couldn't do anything. The axe was driven in too deep, and the girl simply didn't have enough strength. Axel watched her for a while, and then, smiling, he said that he thought she could do it, so he wasn't going to help her and told her to handle it herself. Jade kept trying to get the axe out of the log. She couldn't understand how it was possible that she couldn't do something so easy. After some time, she finally managed to get the axe out of the stump. The man had already begun to doubt that she would ever succeed and had lost even a little hope. The next minute, she swung to chop one of the logs, but at that moment the axe outweighed her a little, and she lost her orientation. Jade dropped her instrument on the ground and almost fell herself, but Axel arrived in time and caught her, hugging her. At that moment, he began to scold her loudly, calling her an idiot and asking if she really needed to try to understand that she couldn't do it, and why she always put herself in danger. The man was simply furious. He couldn't understand whether she really didn't know how dangerous an axe could be, since it might not be a simple wound. Jade was a little surprised at how angry he got, and then said that you'll never know for sure unless you try. So that's what she decided to do. The man was not at all convinced by this answer, and he asked whether it was really necessary to get burned to understand that fire can be hot and that it can cause harm. The girl sighed heavily and said that in fact she was exactly the kind of person who, even if it was dangerous, needed to try it on her own skin. Some time passed from that moment. The man finally calmed down a little and told her to go home immediately before she broke something. Jade had to agree with him, but before leaving she asked in which direction the place where Olya lived was. With great difficulty she still managed to reach the place where the elderly woman lived. When Olya saw her, she immediately said hello and said that she was glad to see her. The woman also added, smiling, that when she first saw her, she did not notice because she was very careful at that time. However, her eyes actually sparkle, and it is very pleasant to look at them. The girl, hearing this, was a little surprised and said that she really has a very pleasant and beautiful eye color, so she is flattered to hear such compliments. Immediately after this, Jade said her name and also handed her a jar, saying that it was a medicine that she had prepared from the herbs she had collected. She explained that it was her token of gratitude for saving her. Olya immediately accepted the jar and thanked her, and Jade, in turn, added that she was incredibly grateful for the last time, because Axel said that she would have stayed there if not for Olya. The woman smiled and said that she had simply said a few good words of encouragement, and that Axel had made the final decision himself. The girl was a little surprised to hear this. After that, she said that she had one question and wondered why not everyone lived next to each other. She thought that it would be much safer and easier to share various news. Olya was a little surprised by this question, but she said that they fled to this place because they were tired of people, so they did not see the point in being and living near them. The woman also added that they prefer to live alone, even if it means that they will have to give up several advantages and endure quite a lot of inconveniences. When Jade heard that the people who lived in the forest were tired of people, she immediately wondered what could have made them so tired. Olya said that, whatever the case, the fastest way out was to wait for the traders. But Jade added that she was in a hurry because she did not have enough free time to wait for several months. The woman replied that she should know that she was very lucky. The wind might be easily irritated and different from other people, but he was not a bad person at all, so she just needed to be a little more patient. Olya also said that if she were in her place, she would stay for a while, no matter how much she was in a hurry to return. The woman explained that she too sometimes needs to have such a period in her life, a period in which she can simply go with the flow of time. Jade, when she heard this, immediately thought about these words. She realized that this was completely different from her perception of the world. In fact, the girl had no choice before. She was always busy and never took a break, because that's how she was taught. Even when she was sick and very tired, she had to work hard. And all because the moment she let her guard down even for a second played a bad joke on her. That's when she got her knife in the back. That same evening, an elderly man was sitting in his office and suddenly read an important letter that had come to him. The contents of this letter made him completely angry. In fact, he thought that he could make a profit while Jade was away. However, she ended up blocking every path. To think that he couldn't even choose one trading group to trade with in the forest with their home was like death. He thought it was all crazy, but he knew it was the best time to start saving money because he didn't know what might happen in the future. But then suddenly the door to the room opened and a young girl entered, who called him her father. When the man saw her, he was very surprised and asked why she had come. This girl's name was Azelia. She only asked her father in a trembling voice if he had been able to find Jade, since there had been no news from her for quite a long time, and the girl was very worried. The guy sighed heavily and said that he knew absolutely nothing. Someone still had to give the order. Azelia, when she heard this, immediately realized that this was definitely not a good sign. So she started yelling at her father, asking if he was really not going to look for Jade. Her father himself had a rather hot temper, so when he started yelling at her, he asked her if she really thought that was the most important thing in their situation. Without giving her a chance to respond, he continued yelling at his daughter, saying that he thought he had finally gotten rid of this girl. But something went wrong again, and she ruined everything. After a moment of silence, the girl turned to her father and asked why he didn't start looking for her right now, since it was possible that Jade was in big trouble. Then he came closer to Azelia, put his hand on her face, and called her his beloved daughter. He also said that she was too naive for this world, so she should learn from him how to really live in the world. He asked her if she didn't know what their peaceful life was costing him, and added that they had a large estate, dozens of servants who worked in their house, and enough dowry so that he could marry her off to a good man. After the last words, he started shouting and said that all this was very hard. Then he grabbed her face with his hands so that her jaw even crunched a little. And then, in an icy voice, he said that at least this girl Jade was an exceptional fire mage, but Azelia didn't even have that kind of talent, so she would have to join a good family whether she wanted to or not. His hands suddenly started shaking, but he continued to hold her jaw and said that when she was still very young, he thought that she would be able to achieve something. However, she does not even have enough mana to fill a puddle with water. After this, the father finally let the poor girl go, and she, holding her face, said that even if this was a slightly modest place, she still did not think that everything was so bad. Her father was incredibly angry and said that she, as someone who had never lived like this, should consider all this happiness, not freedom. She should think, first of all, about how she would live happily in wealth, and not how she would be treated there. But at that moment, he put his hand on her shoulder and said that she needed to finally open her eyes, because they were all in the same boat and floating down the same current. He whispered in Azelia's ear that if they wanted to continue their luxurious life, then Jade Brown must not exist at all. After that, he smiled, moved away from her, and said that this was exactly why he made her disappear. When the young girl heard all this, she was horrified and in a trembling voice asked her father what he meant by this. However, he asked with a smug expression if she really didn't understand anything, and then repeated again that they were in the same boat, and as long as she was his daughter, no one would be able to believe in her innocence. He also said that he hoped that Jade would die there, or at least lose at least one limb, and also said that if he did not hear any news from her in the near future, he would even arrange her funeral. The father also told his daughter not to worry, because he would marry her off to someone from a prestigious family, and she could be sure that everything would be fine without Jade. But Azelia was not happy about this at all. She was horrified by what she heard from her father, and could not believe that he really was such a terrible person. At that moment, the girl remembered how she always loved to play with Jade as a child. They really loved to climb into a small treehouse. One day, Jade invited Azelia there again. However, the girl replied that they could not do this because her father would be very angry. He would say that noble ladies cannot do such things and scold them. However, at that moment she said that it was all nonsense and they were not at all old enough to be women and ladies. Therefore, they could afford to play and frolic a little more. Smiling, Jade suggested that they leave as soon as possible, since they still needed to decorate the gardener's treehouse with the ribbon she had taken with her. And now, when Azelia was left completely alone, she incredibly missed that joyful Jade, who was always up for various adventures. In fact, when Jade was still very little, everyone humiliated and insulted her. Many even doubted that she really was the daughter of the Count. People mocked the poor little girl and said that the successor of the house had been a talented person for generations. However, The only thing she was good at was fire magic. People also said that if she really was Yannick's heir, she wouldn't be so incompetent. Some suggested that perhaps she was grieving greatly after her mother's death. However, others believed that there was not even a drop of Yannick's blood in her, and that her mother had found a way to have a baby girl somewhere. Of course, Jade always fought them off and said it was all a lie. But often after everything that happened, she had nightmares of these same heartless people grabbing her. And so, while Jade was sleeping in the hut, she had the same dream again. The man grabbed her leg and told her that she did not deserve to be the heir to her family. She tried to defend her opinion and said that she was a magician who was recognized even by the king, and she just needed to wait for the coming-of-age ceremony. And then the problem would definitely be solved. But then the man suddenly smiled and asked her if she really thought so, and also asked how she was going to conduct this ceremony, since she was stuck in that place forever. When Jade heard the last words, she immediately woke up in horror. She breathed heavily for a while, trying to come to her senses after this nightmare. After some time, the girl finally calmed down and realized that she had no reason to worry at all, because it was just a dream. She knew that she was tired all the time because of such idiotic dreams and couldn't get a good night's sleep. However, at least they didn't affect her much, since she was used to hearing such things and didn't often dwell on them. Soon, when day came, the girl went to the fireplace, threw in several different things and herbs that she had collected, and began to boil it all in a huge bucket. Axel, who was just about to head into the thick of the forest, looked at her in surprise. When Jade was at Olya's, she took her old clothes. The girl was very focused on preparing something mysterious and making sure there was no foam and that the color was good. Axel, moving away, said that this was probably why magic potions were always brewed in dark and gloomy places. In fact, the smell was absolutely disgusting throughout his hut, and it was not a pleasant sight. But Jade asked him not to tell Ollie anything about the ingredients. She wanted it to remain her secret. When the man opened the door to leave, the girl asked when he would be back this time. Axel sighed heavily and said that he would be back before sunset, so she shouldn't worry. The girl waved goodbye and told him to take care of himself. After the door closed without an answer, she sighed heavily and thought that he was completely ignorant. She said goodbye to him, and he didn't even answer. In fact, it had been a few days since Jade had started to actively live in the Atnas Forest. At some point, she got used to her life in a completely unfamiliar place, even without magic. When Axel went outside, she would prepare special medicines or do housework to pass the time. During the day, Jade would visit Olya's house, help her out, or just gossip with her. That day, the girl also went to the old woman's house to collect some of her crops. Ollie asked her if she would like to hear about how she met her husband. Jade immediately became excited and said that it must be a fascinating story and she would like to know more. Ollie sighed heavily and said that, to be honest, the beginning was not as romantic as one might think. Her personality was very aggressive and cruel in her youth. She said that she was incredibly cold towards her husband when he tried to talk to her. It was so cold that he cried every day as soon as he got home. When Jade heard this very interesting detail, she smiled and asked if he really cried. Olya came closer to her and said that it was so. However, in the end, she still fell in love with him and added that she came to one truth. There are things that cannot be decided or predicted at the first meeting. So everything changes, and even tastes can change over time. Jade, coming down the stairs, wondered where her husband was now. The woman answered in a completely calm voice that he was dead. He passed away peacefully without suffering at all, so you could say that it was even good. Then Olya, smiling, began to return to her house and said that a lot of time had passed since he died, so she could not make a frightened expression on her face because of this. The woman also said that if she really felt sorry for her, she could feed the goats for her before she left. Jade was a little upset when she heard the story about her husband and agreed to do it for Olya. Some time had passed since then. The sun was already far in the sky, and Jade, having finally finished all her chores, began to head back. The woman handed her a basket of fruit and asked her to wait until it ripened a little more before eating it. although she was sure that Jade knew all this perfectly well. The girl took the basket, thanked him, and went home through the forest. Looking at one of the peaches, she thought about what Olya had said, that they would make very sweet jam. So she decided that she would definitely have to try it and make it. Jade also thought that Axel would probably be the person who would help her do this. Then suddenly, when she found a little further, she heard some strange sound nearby. Turning to the side, she looked under the tree and saw an incredible miracle that she did not even expect to encounter in this forest. In fact, under the tree she looked into, there were yellow, showy mushrooms growing. They looked just incredibly beautiful, but in reality, they were also rare. These yellow mushrooms were a rare ingredient for magical healing potions, and they were also incredibly effective. So when Jade saw them, she beamed with joy. Before, she had to pay several gold pieces for a fingernail-sized piece of these mushrooms, and here they were growing right in front of her. She still found it hard to believe that she was seeing one of them in real life and could take it for herself. And just as Jade was reaching out to pick it up, something suddenly dripped on her. She immediately opened her hand to see what it was and saw some kind of green slime running down her fingers. The girl could already guess what it was, so she slowly and carefully raised her head up, and then she saw the most terrible thing that could be there. In response, some incredibly large and terrible monster was crawling towards Jade. It had a mouth and several more in it, and a huge tongue sticking out. Jade immediately stood up and slowly began to walk as far away from the tree as she could. She couldn't believe that she had actually met a monster in the forest. Without thinking twice, the monster immediately noticed her and pounced. It ran and almost scratched the girl with its large paws, but Jade managed to jump away in time. She screamed loudly, realizing that this monster would be a big problem for her because she couldn't use magic, which meant that she was almost disarmed. Jade knew perfectly well that she had to run away as quickly as possible because she couldn't use spells, which meant that the monster would be able to defeat her in no time. So without thinking twice, she immediately rushed forward. But the monster turned out to be much more agile and was able to go around her from the other side, ending up right in front of her face. The girl began to worry very much because the tongue, which was incredibly long, grabbed her neck and began to lift it up. Jade continued to scream loudly, but after a while she couldn't anymore. The tongue was squeezing her throat more and more tightly, and she began to choke. Jade couldn't believe that she would actually die stupidly in the forest from some monster. This definitely wouldn't have happened to her if she had magic. However, at the moment when she already thought that she would finally die, a miracle happened. The girl suddenly felt someone embrace her body, and then a male voice spoke. She recognized it immediately. It belonged to Axel. He asked what had happened. Then he took the girl away from the monster. She was so shocked that she couldn't say a word, and the man asked her if getting into trouble was her hobby. After some time, Jade finally came to her senses and immediately asked how he even knew that she was there. The man said that she screamed very loudly and that her voice carried throughout the forest. So it was quite easy for him to understand that someone was in trouble. Axel also said that it would have been much slimmer if he hadn't heard her because she was screaming really incredibly loudly. Jade sighed heavily at that moment and looked away from him. But then the man suddenly spoke again and asked how long she planned to remain in the position she was in at that moment. The girl did not immediately understand what he meant, but then suddenly noticed that her hand was right on his chest. Because of this, she felt completely awkward. Jade immediately realized that he was still holding her in his arms, so she screamed loudly, asking him to let her go immediately. Of course, he immediately obeyed her, and after that, the two of them went to the hut. As soon as the girl found herself completely alone, she felt simply terrible. She could not understand how this had happened to her. She really couldn't believe that she almost died from some monster just because she couldn't use magic. Of course, if she wasn't in that forest, she would have burned it down right away. However, because she was stuck in that hole, she couldn't even defend herself properly. Sighing heavily, Jade said in a low voice that this was probably why they said that a mage had to visit the forest at least once to prove that he was truly capable. Then Axel, seeing the state she was in, immediately approached her and asked why she was there at such a late hour, and also added that Ali had warned him that she had left much earlier. Jade, when she heard about this, realized that the doctor was useless, so she decided to tell the truth that she found very rare mushrooms and lost track of time. Holding back her disappointment, she said that she knew perfectly well that she had been stupid, so she asked him to forgive her for making him worry. Axel ignored her words and also said that he forgot to tell her in advance that the favorite food of monsters is actually magicians, so she should be very careful. Jade sighed heavily and said that she couldn't use magic, but she was popular, and that was the worst thing for her. After that, looking somewhere into the void, she also said that she never thought that she would be at the bottom of the food chain of monsters, and she had always been at the top. But then, suddenly Axel came closer to her and said that they should stop talking already. Then he took her foot, asking her not to resist, and quickly took off her shoe. Before Jade could come to her senses, she couldn't do anything, because the man grabbed her foot and took off her shoe so quickly that she didn't even understand how it happened. She immediately started screaming loudly, asking what he was doing. Meanwhile, Axel began to carefully examine her leg, which was red, and said that he had assumed that it would be a bad bruise. Continuing to examine her injuries, he said that she looked very worried and as if she had some discomfort as soon as she returned to the hut. He said he noticed it, so he decided to check it out. Jade then asked with a smile on her face if he really noticed that she was somehow uncomfortable. After that, she replied that it was a bit strange because she wouldn't show that she was somehow uncomfortable in public. Axel then looked her straight in the eye and asked, was she really trying to argue now? To prove that he was wrong? Even if she really did have a very damaged ankle? Jade immediately began to quickly say that this was not what she meant at all, and also explained that she simply never showed her weakness to others, because then you are very easy to manipulate. She also explained that this is why she thought she had not expressed her pain earlier, and also thought she was very good at pretending that everything was fine. Well, Axel, after listening to her, said that it was completely pointless in his opinion. After that, he returned to examining her ankle again. Then Jade couldn't take it anymore. She suddenly started yelling at him and asked what he meant when he said it was pointless, and also asked if he could even imagine how hard her life was. By that time, the man had brought all the necessary instruments to treat her wound and asked, did he really need to know all this? Without waiting for an answer, Axel also added that he was not at all interested in what weaknesses she had, because they barely knew each other. And that's why he said that she could absolutely not waste her energy on something like that and useless, especially if she would be causing herself even more harm in doing so. When Jade heard this again, she was very surprised. But he summed it up by saying that next time she should tell him if she got hurt or if something hurt, because it was her health and she should control it herself, and also know when to ask for help. As he continued to bandage her leg, he said that he could heal her injuries quite quickly, so there was no need for her to make the situation worse. After he finished, he began to get up on his feet. Jade, looking at him in surprise, asked, in that case, would he really come to save her again if she was suddenly attacked by a monster again? Axel asked in surprise what else she thought he could do. Did she really think he would just leave her there to die? He started to turn around and walk away, and Jade said that she couldn't give him anything in return for that. The man asked, did she really think that he was helping her just to get some kind of reward, knowing that she had absolutely nothing? The girl didn't answer. She just looked at his muscular back and immediately smiled, feeling safe. In fact, all the time she had to answer for herself. And now, when she is not alone, and when she feels next to her a person who really cares about her, she cannot help but feel happy. After a moment of silence, she asked him if he would come to her in that case to take her back to the hut if she was late again. Axel, surprised, asked how she had even come to that conclusion, since he had implied that she should just stay home and not wander around the streets, especially if it was dark. When the next morning came, Jane decided to practice cooking. She stood at the stove until lunchtime, making some new dish that she had come up with in her head. Axel, as always, prepared breakfast for the two of them, and soon she came to the table, which was already set, and said that she had also prepared one dish. But as soon as she put it on the table, she immediately asked him what he thought. In fact, this dish was simply disgusting and did not smell very good either. Axel didn't bother to worry about her tender feelings, and without even trying the dish, he told her to just take it and throw it away as quickly as possible. Jane immediately became very indignant and said that she would not do this because these eggs were from Ollie and they were very valuable, so she could not just take and throw them away. Axel, sighing heavily, said that she was the only person he had ever seen who had spoiled the valuable eggs. Jane tried to somehow rehabilitate her dish and said that, of course, it does not look very appetizing. However, she is sure that if you eat it, everything will be fine. The man said that in that case she should at least try one spoonful of her wonderful masterpiece. The girl herself didn't really like this idea. However, she had to defend her rightness, so after eating some bread, she ate a whole spoonful. After that, looking at the man with disdain, she said that he didn't even know how expensive such food was, so he couldn't just throw it away. She didn't think it was necessary to throw away the dish if something went wrong. The girl also said that it wasn't as disgusting as it might seem, so it was quite possible to eat it. Axel looked at her in surprise and asked, did she really have to go hungry when she was outside the forest, since this food seemed good to her?